Everyone. We're going to be covering radioactive waste today. As you can see, some of these pictures, mostly older dated pictures, just show the state of some of the waste situation prior to some federal laws that attempted to, make this sort of mess a rarity. So general waste strategies, health physics, one of the less glamorous aspects of radiation safety is dealing with radioactive waste. So we have a lot of essentially janitorial duties of isolating radioactive waste and seeing it to where it needs to go, whether that is, you know, sorted ourselves, we can decay it on site, or we can ship it and get rid of it. Those are generally our three options. So we'll take a look at it. One of the big ones actually is somewhat more recent, the idea of decay and storage. So you have something radioactive. If it doesn't have a prohibitively long half-life, you can just leave it be and it'll eventually decay away to something stable, at which point you can dispose of it generally as just regular waste, unless it has some other hazardous material in it as well. But we do this a lot. We have a lot of shorter half-life isotopes that we use in the medical environment. And this is great for us because we can keep them for a couple weeks, couple months, and then just dispose of them as regular trash. A big example of this is all of the patient waste that we gather from PET scans, from F-18. Patients that get those PET scans will leave behind trace amounts of radioactive material, whether they immediately go to the cafeteria and blow their nose. Those are things that actually will set off portal monitors around our institute. And so we segregate that trash. We know that it's generally short-lived stuff, so we'll hang on to it for a couple of days, a week, and then we can then re-release it to the regular waste stream and not get in trouble with accidentally releasing radioactive materials. So how we do that is generally, if you know the isotope, the half-life, you can make a very good guess as to when it would be ready for disposal. We use the rule of thumb called 10 half-lives. It's not perfect because that reduces the activity to a little bit less than 1,000th of what it originally was. So if you're talking about trace contamination on something like patient waste, generally 1,000 times less will be enough to get rid of it. But if you have millicurie amounts or more, even 1,000 times less will still be fairly radioactive, will still be enough to set off portal alarms, to potentially get in trouble if those activities do leave your institute. So that's why when we say 10 half-lives, but always when you are getting ready to dispose of something that you think may no longer be radioactive, first thing you do is you pick up a meter and you make sure that it is what we call indistinguishable from background. So that means that you would turn on your meter, take a background, put it up to the waste, and you should not hear any excess clicks from that meter. So this is something that we do all day, every day, just slowly getting rid of stuff that is gathered, trying to minimize this waste. We do also ship out a lot of stuff. We have some longer lived isotopes that are still under that 120-day threshold. That decay and storage has 120 days or less. That's a regulatory requirement. You can't hold stuff that's longer than 120 days because what the regulators fear is someone saying, oh, all this stuff in storage is decaying in storage. And then it just builds up. And then that respective business may go out of business. And then suddenly the regulator or the city or the state is on the hook for disposing of this material. So it's in their interest that, that these storage closets or storage rooms don't build with this long-lived material that may end up being their problem. That's why they limit it to 120 days. But some stuff we get rid of, we have lots of iodine-125, which is 60-day half-life. That means that 10 half-lives, 600 days. You're talking about a couple of years for this stuff to potentially decay away. So sometimes it's just easier to ship it out. Sometimes isotopes, you'll decay away, and for some reason they're not decaying as fast as you think they should. And then you realize that some of these isotopes, the way that they are produced, they have trace level of contaminants. So if that contaminant has a significantly longer half-life, over time, it will grow in proportion to the original source. As that original source decays away, but the contaminant doesn't decay away, you will have a source that eventually becomes pretty much completely that contaminant. And in that case, it may be a much longer lived half-life. It may be something you have to dispose of as specialty waste because you don't have the means of just decaying it in storage anymore. So you have to use a licensed waste brokers for this. They're getting harder and harder to find. There's more and more restrictions about where this waste can actually go. So some waste brokers have sort of exclusive rights to certain locations for dumping their waste. And so that's why it's become more and more common to decay on site. There's the cost aspect, and there's also just the difficulty of actually getting rid of this material. We have one main vendor that, if they were to go out of business, we might be in a little bit of trouble. We'd have a hard time replacing their function. But once it's taken by the waste broker, they're not actually doing it. They're just transporting the material to these waste sites. These waste sites have a little bit more robust equipment to super duper compact it. Sometimes they may have a license to incinerate it. They can further sort the material. There's some technologies coming out to deal with real high level waste stuff that comes out of nuclear power plants. They can actually take this material and what they call vitrify it, essentially turn it into glass. Because one of the biggest issues with long-term burial of material is how you make sure that material stays in whatever you buried it. If you have something that's going to be radioactive for 10,000 years, 100,000 years, a solid metal drum will not retain its structural integrity over that long of a time frame. So you have to be concerned that this material is not eventually going to get into groundwater and irradiate or make sick future populations of people. This is one of the main reasons why a lot of these places are shutting down. There's these regulations that require further and further more and more effort in order to make sure that these materials stay where they're supposed to. So some of the regulations that have come out, some of the federal acts, a big one is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This was actually the first federal regulation that acknowledged that there was no federal regulation for how waste is disposed. So you had a lot of situations like the first graphic to this presentation was what was called the Valley of the Drums. It was a waste site in Kentucky that had just millions and millions of drums that were just kind of strewn about or dumped or essentially just left there, out of sight, out of mind type thing. And it just got completely out of hand to the point where it was recognized that there needs to be some concerted federal action to make sure this doesn't continue to happen. So that was the first one to sort of get out ahead of the waste generation and figure out a better way to prevent this from happening in the future. A term you'll hear is cradle to grave. That's sort of an EPA thing. The EPA was given responsibility for this waste stream from its generation through its use to its ultimate disposal. A difficult thing from anybody in that sort of generation, use, disposal chain is that if a site in the future needs to be cleaned up, and you have material in that site, you can be held responsible for that cleanup, which can be a very huge amount of money to do. The problem is that if your site is the only, or your institute is the only active site, or the only active company in a site that has disposed of many different companies worth of material, you can be on the hook for everything because they want somebody to ultimately be responsible for it. And if there's only one current business still running, they may come after you to try to clean up the site. So that's a big responsibility. You have to really make sure that your waste is being handled in a way that you won't have future liability down the road. If you plan to, operate something like MSK, should hopefully be around for a while. So we want to make sure that we're using reputable waste brokers that aren't just dumping this waste any which way that's going to end up kind of biting us in the ass. Another piece of legislation that came a little bit after that first one is called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So this was in conjunction with the RCRA in that it was also not just to change the way waste is produced, but to actually go out and fix a lot of the worst sites that had already caused problems. You've probably heard of the term Superfund. So this established that Superfund site designation. So there were, you take the worst of these environmental sites, and it just devoted some sort of money and action to start cleaning them up. And there have been a number of them that have been cleaned up. It's, it has done a lot of good, but it's a slow moving effort, and there's still lots and lots of Superfund sites out there. You can actually have some fun looking up Superfund sites you may not realize exist. Like I went into that Superfund site and found out that my hometown in Connecticut has 2 Superfund sites. My old neighborhood in Ridgewood was like a block away from an old Superfund site. So it's a little sobering to realize just how many areas in the country have been really messed up by, by industrial activity. But there is some work, some money that is going into rectifying some of the worst abuses of the past before any sort of regulation controlled this stuff. But that's really it for waste. So we'll talk about it in class. Thanks.